las ediciones del Tractatus en España están bajo las manos o sobre el derecho de una editorial, que es la de Alianza Editorial. En España, no sé, en otros países no. Cuando Java se enteró de que en España los chicos del bachillerato, en el colegio, al final del colegio, tienen que hacer un examen de filosofía, y el tema de filosofía es el Tractatus Lógico-Filosófico, se echó las manos a la cabeza y dijo: ¿cómo? ¿En España se hace el Tractatus en la escuela? Sí, no en la universidad, en la escuela. Pero eso supone que todos los años se hacen 2, 3 ediciones del Tractatus. Toda España tiene que comprar el Tractatus, todos los chicos tienen que comprar el Tractatus. Hacer una nueva traducción del Tractatus por un individuo en Toledo era imposible, ¿no? Entonces se me ocurrió la idea de publicar el Tractatus, pero no en la edición de 1922, sino el original. El profesor Köhler, de la Universidad de Viena, había encontrado en el archivo de su padre, de Köhler, el profesor que había trabajado con Wittgenstein en Kirchberg, el manuscrito original, y hace 3 años lo cedió a la Biblioteca Nacional Austriaca. Entonces pedí permiso al profesor Köhler para publicar una edición facsímil de ese tratado, me la concedió, pedimos los derechos a la Biblioteca Nacional y a los trustees, porque tanto todavía en Cambridge, nos concedieron y hemos publicado, mejor dicho, la editorial ha publicado una edición facsímil original del tratado. El manuscrito creo que es el 203 o el 103, hay tantos, el 203, ¿no? ¿Sí? 202, no, pero es que hay 202 y 203, es que uno es mucho. Es la edición de Freire.
Lo que publicaste es en inglés.
Sí.
Está en Oxford.
Sí. Y entonces hemos publicado, y con eso he podido hacer una nueva traducción del Tractatus en español. Porque la primera, ¿cómo traducís vosotros Tigretis a Cefaltis?
Tú querías un caso.
Sí, pero yo es que no quería saber el caso. Porque el caso en español era un periódico como la Cronaca Vela en Italia, el caso de asesinatos. Entonces yo lo que quería era decir que el mundo es todo lo que acontece, todo lo que sucede, todo lo que ocurre, ¿no? Entonces, y así comienza. Desgraciadamente no lo he traído, me lo he olvidado, estaba encima de la mesa y lo he olvidado, pero la semana que viene lo tendréis aquí en el instituto. Yo creo, no por mí, sino la editorial ha hecho una edición facsímil que la propia Biblioteca Nacional ya la tiene a disposición, pero en el Handschrift para que no vayan a ver el manuscrito, sino que tengan eso a disposición en Viena. Bueno, el tema que voy a hablar es un tema muy extraño. Es el concepto de Geflogenheit, que está usado por Wittgenstein en un momento clave, fundamental, el paso, porque rechaza el concepto de regla por ser subjetivo y acepta el concepto de seguir una regla, follow a rule. Es decir, el concepto de regla no funciona por determinados argumentos, Regel, y entonces para conseguir otro concepto diferente necesita una premisa, que es la premisa de Geflogenheit, para hacer el concepto de Regelfolge. Esta premisa, que es mediante el concepto de Geflogenheit, prácticamente es poco estudiado. La mayoría de las personas pasan por encima qué significa Geflogenheit. Y Wittgenstein tiene un uso muy específico del término. Voy a explicar el significado en alemán, voy a explicar el significado en austríaco, que no es alemán. Existe el Hochdeutsch, el Niederdeutsch, que es el alemán, austríaco, y después voy a explicar el significado que le da Wittgenstein al término Geflogenheit, que es muy peculiar. Y a partir de ahí explicar por qué este término es fundamental para constituir la regla following. Well, the notion of Geflogenheit has a central role in Wittgenstein's philosophy. What is understood by Geflogenheit may be described as the usual way of behaving regarding a matter which has become a routine as is fulfilled in a particular social function. One could define it as a set of purposeful action carried out in a regular and repeated way that have thereby become a convention. However, the term Geflogenheit has hardly attracted intention among researchers. The aim of this talk is therefore to examine its meaning and to highlight the ramifications that follow from it. We start from the assumption that the expression Geflogenheit functions as a link between the existence of a rule and the corresponding process of following this rule. The transition from rule to rule following is carried out by a practice based on Geflogenheit. But to what extent can a rule constitute an action without producing contradiction? According to Wittgenstein, many previous attempts to determine human action on the basis of the rule were done to fail. If someone is asked whether his or her action comply with a rule, one would have to introduce subjective criteria to explain one's conduct. To refute this argumentation, we propose the following reasoning. A rule for an action is based on an interpretation, which implies that the term forming part of this rule is replaced by another term. This substitution, however, is merely subjective and is considered arbitrary. It is therefore required to look for objective criteria that allow establishing a relationship between a rule on the one hand and the action resulting from this rule on the other hand. We shall begin with a simple thought experiment. Gedanken experiment in the form of a riddle. Let's imagine a person walking on a trail reaches a forking path, the Vektaden from Wittgenstein, where he sees several signposts pointing in different directions. The signpost shows the distance to different locations in kilometers. Suppose two opposite signs with different length lead to one of the same location. The right pointing, for example, signpost indicating a distance of 7 kilometers to length, where the signpost pointing in straight direction indicate a length of only 5.4 kilometers. How the hiker is confronted with a choice. Which path should be taken? Basically, a signpost indicates a causal relation between location, length, direction, and distance. When the hiker chooses the shorter distance, for instance, because of physical fatigue or hurry, he would allow his choice to be influenced by subjective elements. The causal relationship between location, distance, and direction would therefore be affected by the desire to reach the destination as quickly as possible. The hiker's interpretation is purely subjective and depends on certain physical conditions. Yet, this choice may have been made rationally. It could turn out that the shorter route runs uphill, of the therefore more demanding and also more dangerous, both in which would be more time consuming. In contrast, the longer route could run on flat terrain and would allow the hiker to reach his destination in a short time. However, all these possibilities are not obvious from the signpost. Instead, our hiker had associated the shorter distance with a shorter duration. This thought experiment reveals the limited predictive power of signpost. Although the hiker knows the direction of the length of his route, he does not know much about the details of his route. As such, the signpost does not reveal the different steps that lie on the way between the rule and his corresponding process of rule following. If a hiker reaches a crossroad with various different signs, he would base his choice on certain interpretation. He would interpret our rule subjectively and probably in line with his previous experience. Wittgenstein pointed in the danger that associated with the process of rule, which may be summarized in the following way. First, when established causal link, we tend to hastily assume a relation between elements that is neither obvious nor proved. Second, we use subjective interpretation as basis of our decision making. And in this context, Wittgenstein pointed to the notion of concept of Geflogenheit or custom on several occasions. Despite of the use of the notion, he neither provided a definition nor any explanation of its meaning. The aim of this talk is to elicit his usual meaning before trying to detect the significance that Wittgenstein ascribed to it. And we shall analyze the transition from a given rule on the practice of following this rule. The first point is to analyze what does Geflogenheit mean. The term Geflogenheit is an ancient German or Germanic word that was derived from the verb to care. To care for. The expression care is used in many contexts, such as in to care for someone or something, to perform an activity continuously, or even in the sense of to be in the habit of doing something. Accordingly, his meaning is expressed in diverse language games, such as, for instance, to stand up for something, to be a responsibility for someone or something, and to nurse somebody throughout an illness, to maintain a relationship with, to cultivate contact, to keep on good terms with somebody, etc. In the 19th century, the verb was used as a noun, which gave rise to the concept of custom or habit. If one examines Wittgenstein's use of the word, it turned out to be related to the Austrian officialism, the normally Kanzlersprache, the official language used in the state's administration, such as, for instance, in official announcement, in which Geflogenheit functioned as a code word indicating the traditional way in which things have been dealt with ever since. Wittgenstein had already introduced the notion Geflogenheit in his earlier writing in relation with what he calls a language game, and he described a situation in which someone has to make a decision that produces certain consequences. When asked about the grounds, the decision, Wittgenstein draws an analogy between decision making and language game. The fact that a person used a specific language game to make a decision has to do with the Geflogenheit or custom such person has become used to. He explained this analogy in the following quote: Was wir Spiel nennen, ist eine menschliche Geflogenheit mit einem bestimmten Platz unter anderen menschliche Geflogenheiten. Und ebenso ist das auch die Sprache in alle ihren Formen. Later, he linked Geflogenheit to languages by introducing the concept of what he called Denktechnik, and which could be translated as thinking technique or mental technique. A speaker has a range of possible expression available to express his thought and the way in which a custom or Geflogenheit is carried. Language, thought, and action are inseparably linked among each other and extend a mutual influence. We tend to introduce linguistic expression in line with our ongoing action, whereby we ascribe a meaning to the term we use. By using manifold expression, the speakers further develop his languages. It is impossible to think outside of languages because words are introduced by way of custom. Wittgenstein put it like this: Du sagst also, wer hofft, glaubt, fürchtet, erwartet, das und das sei der Fall, werde eintreten, etc. Bewege sich innerhalb einer Denktechnik und dass es außerhalb einer solchen und also außerhalb einer Geflogenheit kein Denken gibt, so wenig wie ein Sprachen außerhalb einer Sprache. However, what Wittgenstein called a mental technique, Denktechnik, is not supposed to be intrinsic or innate. It rather seemed that he intended to oppose against a Platonic or mentalist view only the development of abilities during language acquisition allows a person to perform mental technique. Such activities are never isolated even but always action-oriented. Wittgenstein described this stage as conceptual indefiniteness, and he viewed it as the starting point of Geflogenheit, the initial phase at which a custom emerges. This is very important. Custom is coupled with a series of abilities and skills development that go along with the language acquisition. From this perspective, psychological questions of certain kinds become irrelevant, such as, for instance, the question of what goes on in a child's mind. Any action is considered to be part of a custom or habit that has been introduced, learned, and trained in a meaningful context. As such, the existing variabilities of life are due to a broad diversity of habits and can be traced back to a whole range of different customs within society. In Wittgenstein's philosophy, the notion of Geflogenheit functions as a linking element in a line of argument. Apart from that, the only context in which it also appears in the process of rule following. The notion seems highly relevant and is implied in the question and is based upon the following rationale. To comply with a rule is never just a single event, but requires repeated actions. If someone has followed a rule just on a single occasion, one cannot speak of a rule-governed process. As Wittgenstein put it, to follow a rule, to send a message, to give an order, to play chess are Geflogenheiten, Gebräuche, and very important, institutionen. Special relevance is this process is attributed to the totality of skills, language gains, and social technique that are associated with this custom. But what actually constitutes a rule? To answer this question, we shall analyze the transitional phase from the general definition of rule to the actual process of following this rule. To define whether a rule has been correctly followed, we have to examine his use. Any rule is situated in a social frame and rests on existing social practice. A rule may be defined as abstract entities whose scope of meaning is known by his users independent of his formal application. One could describe this characteristic as an automatized process of compliances with a rule. On the other hand, it is often said that performance of a specific behavior might simultaneously give rise to new rules. If we examine this assumption in more detail, it seems likely to produce three errors that can be summarized by the following three keywords: explicitness, determinism, and completeness. Explicitness refers to the presumption that a speaker knows a rule explicit before it is applied. One could object that each speaker can correctly apply his own languages without explicitly knowing and his grammar rule. Consequently, we can only rely on the actual behavior that is associated with the process of rule follow. The second error, summarized by determinism, relates to the assumption that the rule to be followed must be specified from the outset. In this context, Wittgenstein even mentioned the possibility of continuously modifying the rule while playing a game. One could, for instance, imagine a ball game in which the players continuously reinvented the rule during the match. And third, completeness implies that each single aspect of one conduct must be determined by a rule and must comply with the rule. However, Wittgenstein argued against this principle, objecting that not everything is limited by rules. Let us imagine a ball game containing the following instruction: throw the ball as high as you can. On the one hand, everyone understands the rule, but on the other hand, it does not clearly delimit the height at which the ball would actually transgress the instruction. Although the rule is, however explicitly started, the instruction is still understood and followed. A rule is often compared to a signpost that indicates the right path, yet it is left to the hiker to decide which path to take or else to opt for a shortcut. If we take up the analogy of the working trade mentioned at the beginning, we could name different ways of how a train can be worked. Here, the expression signpost seems to be an appropriate metaphor that functions as an orientation guide but leave room for decision. The signpost indicate the way, but at the same time they leave several possibilities open of how to make use of it. In this context, the difference between explicit and implicit rule is often disregarded. Of course, the ball can be thrown as high as possible, but the chance of throwing into the designated field is significantly reduced, and with this the chance of winning the match. The same applies to the hiker. The risk that sprains his ankle when walking outside the path is higher. Summarizing this consideration, we notice that we have gained some insight into the informative value of a rule and his interpretation, but we still do not know what is actually understood by a rule. In his book, I make a recall. In paragraph 57 of his big title script, Wittgenstein is concerned with the concept of rule. He looks at the problem from different angles in order to examine the relationship between rule and empirical proposition. Grundsätze. This raises the question of whether the concept of rule is an ambiguous one or subject to various interpretations. Wittgenstein responds to this question with the following metaphor. A rule, as I understand it, is like a path in a garden. Die Regel, wie ich sie verstehe, ist wie ein Weg in einem Garten. At the first look, the quotation seems to emphasize an ambiguity in the context. Examining the strict meaning of the rule, Wittgenstein is confronted with the unclear delimitation of the term. As such, he concludes that many concepts cannot be sharply defined. To examine this indefiniteness in more detail, he introduced the metaphor of a path in a garden, which he compares to a rule that one follows to reach an aim. A path is an accessible trail that allows someone to reach a destination within an unknown or difficult terrain. However, this metaphorical approximation to the problem of rule has a shortcoming as rule implied, the opposite at his point to a constancy of an action. Wittgenstein underlined two characteristics that define the concept of rule. The reason for lack of clarity is due to a confusion of physical and phenomenological language. If one intends to clarify the meaning of a concept by using a wide term, then the problem gets worse. Second, the vagueness is considered an internal property of the concept, by which the infinite quality of a path shall be guarded. All these comments would be no more than literary reduction if they had not narrowed down the topic. The term rule, as Wittgenstein used in the big typescript, is considered itself blurry and wide. He put it like this: Regel ist in dem Sinne ein Begriff mit verschwommenen Rändern, wie Blatt oder Stiel oder Tisch, etc. To illustrate this, we shall make a brief reference to Wittgenstein's later work, in which he treated the topic in more detail compared to the early years, around 1933. The above argument is clearly outlined in the philosophical investigations, in which the term rule is replaced by game, and this is what he said. Man kann sagen, der Begriff Stil ist ein Begriff mit verschwommenen Rändern, aber ist ein verschwommener Begriff überhaupt ein Begriff? Frege vergleicht den Begriff mit einem Bezirk und sagt, einen unklar begrenzten Bezirk könne man überhaupt keinen Bezirk nennen. Das heißt wohl, wir können mit ihm nichts anfangen. Wittgenstein concludes that the term rule and game belong to a family of terms that is characterized by having blurred boundaries, and these are terms whose district cannot be clearly delimited. Their use is of extensional measure, and their meaning cannot be clearly determined. He tries to show that the blurredness of boundaries is a constant, purely extensional feature. That is why Wittgenstein opposed Frege's view of an extensional definition of terms as strictly defined district. What does that exactly mean? Can one assume that we are dealing with a class of concepts whose extension is indefinite, uncertain, or else are certain entities within a rule or a game simply equivalent? Terms such as rule or game cannot be defined without examining his relationship to language. And the problem is that certain term seems to change the extension when being used in a context. Consequently, Wittgenstein asks whether a concept with such characteristics may actually be considered as concept of all. for him is a fundamental concept, and his blurredness is something that can be substituted exceptionally by fixing. Apparently, he says, behind the rule cannot penetrate, because there is no behind. So, Wittgenstein leaves no space for meta rule, nor does he affect a metalogical character of a rule. If rule cannot guarantee objectivity due to their blurredness, and if interpretation behind interpretation is not allowed to have to adopt a Platonic view in the sense that enables us to distinguish between appearances and reality, the private language argument is rooted in this Freudian Platonism. But how can the required objectivity be guaranteed? It is legitimate to ask how such an objective may be ensured. Wittgenstein proposed the following answer. In practice, objective standards can be established that allow us to determine what is correct and what is not. Ethical issues are usually characterized by such objective standards. The ethical problem occurs mainly at the point at which each speaker is asked to make clear when to recognize something as correct, good, allowed, etc. To answer ethical questions, we face the following basic doubt posed by Wittgenstein. How have we learned the meaning of this word, good example? In the context of what sort of example, in which language case, you will then easily see that the word must have a family of meaning. As we will see later, this family resemblance gives rise to the so-called institution as an integral part of custom. Wittgenstein tried to solve the puzzle very elegantly in the philosophical investigation. The term Geflogenheit was translated to English as custom. Since both of them, the English and the German, do not overlap exceptionally, we have briefly examined the use of Geflogenheit. We shall now examine Wittgenstein's use of the concept more closely. We will focus on family resemblances and look into some language game in which the term actually occurs. This allows us to examine the difference and similarity between Geflogenheit on the one hand and custom on the other hand. In this context, we shall refer to the social dimension of language as opposed to private language. By examining language game, we will reveal the technique that helped to consolidate the institutional character of custom. Any objective feature related to the process of rules following can only be analyzed on the basis of custom. A Geflogenheit constitutes the basis on which the social dimension of language rests. Wittgenstein explained it like this. Die Worte Sprache, Satz, Befehl, Regel, Rechnung, Experiment, einer Regel folgen, beziehen sich auf eine Technik, auf eine Gepflogenheit. Eine Vorstufe zum Handeln nach einer Regel wäre etwas die Lust an einfache Regelmäßigkeiten, wie das Klopfen, einfache Rhythmen oder Zeichen oder Betrachten einfacher Ornamente. Man könnte jemand also abrichten, dem Befehl zufolge, zeichne etwas Regelmäßiges. Klopfe regelmäßig. Und hier wieder muss man sich eine bestimmte Technik vorstellen. This quote shows that custom is associated a range of techniques and skills that are performed while carrying out the various course of everyday life. Such techniques are not estimated as true or false, but are simply employed because they appear useful and practicable. At first, prerequisite for the acquisition and practice of a technique is a consensus with others on the execution of such technique. A student may, for instance, be asked in the form of language game to exercise a regular technique. Part of a technique is always a prediction in which the interaction of technique is based on the construction of its linguistic framework. And this is again linked to the question if and what is to be used for, ob und wozu sie dann zu gebrauchen sind. Wittgenstein illustrates this by example from the field of mathematics. So untersucht die Mathematik auch nicht ein Kontinuum. Untersucht nicht ein Kontinuum, also ein Kontinuum, ein abstraktes, nämlich etwas, das mathematische Kontinuum, sondern konstruiert einen Begriff des Kontinuums. Das heißt, sie stellt gewisse Regeln für den Gebrauch der Worte Kontinuum, kontinuierlich, unter anderem auf. Und es fragt sich nun, ob und inwiefern das so gebildete Spiel mit Worten nützlich ist bei der Beschreibung eines kontinuierlichen Tatbestandes. Der term technique is only relevant regarding a procedure that is applied. Technique here means to solve problems. Only throughout a technique is it possible to understand the notion of regularity. The same applies to custom. The process of rule following presupposes the term rule as well as Gepflogenheit or technique. Only throughout custom based on consensus and regularity can a technique be carried. Custom is the link between rule following a rule and is therefore considered external. One may perceive a rule in this sense but may not consider it as custom. It is because of this view that Wittgenstein could not find an objective answer to the question of how a rule can teach us what to do in a particular case. The problem is that the acting person must first perceive a situation and then combine this perception with the corresponding rules. But this leads to a paradox, because any interpretation of the situation would be a state of limbo and would not solve the problem. The reason is that an interpretation does not necessarily determine the actual meaning of what is interpreted, and therefore Wittgenstein cannot establish a clear link between rule and action on the basis of interpretation. If one created a model in which action, rule, and interpretation interact mutually, one would have to establish a causal relationship of stimulus-response, which is nothing more than a reaction acquired by education and training. And this model would provide an answer as to how an agent tends to act when confronted with a forking path. Yet it will leave the question unanswered about what rule following actually means. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein goes one step further and say that someone follows a same path insofar as there is a constant use, a custom, and an established habit. If a rule cannot provide any objective criteria, another element must be taken into consideration. This is what Wittgenstein called to follow a rule. to say that an agent privately followed a rule on one single occasion does not make a short. Any sense from the grammatical point of view, it would be the same as to ask whether a player may invent and develop a game of chess on a single occasion. Wittgenstein negates this question. The reason lies to the meaning itself. As a rule, is a utility-governed procedure that was socially constructed and has thereby become accustomed. Any action that we accomplish by following a rule is considered custom and institution. They include techniques that have been acquired within a social frame and are passed to over time. One can only follow a rule if one has acquired the corresponding language game by which it is expressed, and only if one has learned the technique associated with it. I must, from this, and at the end, a conclusion in a very... We may use the word a rule without having provided a proper definition of it. Wittgenstein denominated this a tabulieren and put it like this. So ist es mir erlaubt, das Wort Regel zu verwenden, ohne notwendig erst die Regel über dieses Wort zu tabulieren. Following Wittgenstein, the word rule appears insufficient to explain the meaning of game because of his blurred and indefinite character. Any index of rules is normally incomplete and lacks definite rules on how to deal with borderline cases. Nevertheless, it is essential to make provision when dealing with a rule. Of course, we need definition of what is to be considered a rule, yet such definition should not include any dogmas. Thank you.
So perhaps we have time for two questions.
I'm interested in this concept of Gedanken technique because I'm studying the traditional arts of memory. And
Memory.
Arts of memory, yes, in classical Greece and Rome through the Renaissance. And basically, according to these techniques, especially in a time when we didn't have written materials readily available, in order to memorize, let's say, a speech, you would go through the building, you would memorize the disposition of the rooms, and in each room, you would memorize it, and in each room, mental room, you would put vivid images that would give you the gist of what you're going to talk about. So this was not something, it's not a matter of memorize the discourse in all its words, but since, for instance, speech, public speech in classical Greece or Rome especially, should be adapted to the context, basically you would be able to memorize the gist of each part of your argument. And these, of course, developments in the Middle Ages, in this time not focused on rhetoric but on preaching and praying, etc. And I would like to know how this idea of Gedanken technique could be related to this, because in this case we have an external technique, an external medium that will help you think about something and talk about it. Okay? So I'm not sure, I'm not familiar with this concept of Gedanken technique, and I'd like to know if there's a way of relating it to, let's say, external media. Another example would be writing something down and helping you memorize and talk about something.
But I don't find Wittgenstein's the relationship between Gedankentechnik and memory more than I see the relationship or the special meaning of Gedankentechnik as a special form of the analysis of language that we normally use and that we normally has learned in our process of learning the languages, and that we use to characterize or describe a special situation. This is not a mentalistic or inner process. More than this is a process that you must present in the analysis of your language or the language that you use. For example, this is important for him to analyze the characteristic of the word rules. Rules as a term that are a blurring term, and which element constitute the meaning of this concept, and when will we use this concept in many language games. This is the term Gedankentechnik. This is probably the problem is the typical concept of Gedanke. Gedanke in the 19th century, the philosophy of mind, the philosophy and language-speaking countries are more identified with a mental process. But I don't know, Nuno or other person probably can say about the psychological process with
I was asking this because basically you resort to something external to you, because it was not just a matter of memorizing things, because you could use this store of external knowledge and, for instance, resorting to the architecture of buildings, etc., in order to think about something. It was not just a matter of reciting something that you remember. Okay? It's a matter of developing an argument. Let's say Thomas Aquinas, for instance, he developed lots of arguments in the Summa by resorting to this memory he acquired through his interaction with an external medium. Okay? So it was not just something that he just remembered internally. So you had to make use of something that is in the environment in order to help you to remember, because memory was very valuable at the time because it was part of the virtues, etc. Okay, and since you didn't have external material like lots of books, etc., you had to use it as a tool in order to think about something, argue about something. So that's why I was thinking of this idea of Gedankentechnik. And there were rules about it, very loose rules. So you didn't have a manual telling you how to apply this technique, so it would have to be adjusted to every situation, to every context. Okay, so that's.
But I see the problem from another point of view. For Wittgenstein, the memory, the question about memory is not a question about internal process. This is another question. You speak in prepositions. I have a proposition. Ich lese Zeitung. And this is a proposition. And the word to lesen had a meaning, had a context. I can use the same word in other contexts, and the meaning are different from this context. But this is not in introspective process. The problem is about the inner, the content, and the meaning of this word in this context, in this use. And this is structural, it's not introspective. And when you say, ich lese, and this is wine, for example, wine lese, wine lese is to prove wine. The meaning of this And the content of this word, lese, unlese, is different. And this different is not in the mental process from that I must reveal so what kind of memory process I have. I can remember that this word normally will be used in a special context, and this word will be used in another context. And the contents, the inhalt, and the meaning of this word is dependent from the use that we make from the same word. Only, but Wittgenstein say this is the difference. And the same problem is with the word rules. We can use the word rules in mathematical process, in linguistic process, in other process, but I presuppose in this use of the word rules many mental process that I cannot presuppose when I say eine Regel folge or eine Regel zu folgen, because Regel folge, following a rule, presuppose a custom. I must learn this objective process. This is very different to the mental process from I can remember that I say, and this is in my memory. These I don't know this typical argument in Wittgenstein philosophy. This is from my point of view is for interpretation, but this is a subjective point of view. From
Okay, we must.
Thank you.
Go ahead.